At a lavish dinner, my husband smiled at his ex and said, "She's the most beautiful woman I've ever known." Everyone waited for me to react, to cry, to argue, to embarrass myself. I didn't. I smiled instead, because while he was trying to impress her, I was quietly ending our marriage. The restaurant glowed the way expensive places always do. Warm light bouncing off polished silverware, crystal glasses chiming softly every time someone gestured too enthusiastically. It was the kind of place Mark loved because it made him feel important just by sitting there. Power by association, status by proximity. He picked it himself, saying it was perfect for a grown-up night out, which was his way of saying he expected me to behave, smile, and not complicate things. The table was full. Colleagues from his firm. Two couples we saw just often enough to call friends. And then there was her, Elena, his ex-tall, effortless, wearing red in a way that suggested she had never once worried about being too much. I noticed how Mark's posture changed the moment he saw her, how his voice lifted, how his laugh came easier. I noticed because I had been married to him for 12 years, and I knew the difference between politeness and performance. When he suggested she join us, it happened so quickly I barely had time to process it. A hand on my back, a step forward, introductions already happening. Saying no would have made a scene. Saying yes made me invisible. I chose invisibility. At the time, I thought it was restraint. I didn't yet realize it was clarity arriving early. The conversation started harmlessly enough. Work, travel, the usual curated versions of our lives. Elena talked about her recent move, her new role at a design firm overseas. Mark listened like a student again, nodding, asking questions, leaning in. I sipped my wine and observed the way you do when you suddenly feel like a guest in your own marriage. Then someone commented on how stunning Elena looked. It was meant as flattery, nothing more. A social reflex. Mark could have laughed politely. He could have agreed vaguely. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, smiling, eyes fixed on her, and said it. "My ex is the most beautiful woman I've ever known." He didn't stutter. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look at me. The sentence landed on the table like a dropped glass, shattering the rhythm of conversation. There was a brief silence, the kind people only notice when something has gone wrong. Forks paused midair. Someone cleared their throat. I felt every pair of eyes slide toward me. Waiting, that was the moment I was supposed to react. I knew the script. I'd seen it play out 100 times in other people's lives. A sharp comment. A forced laugh. Tears excused to the bathroom. A fight in the car on the way home. Public humiliation followed by private reconciliation. A cycle designed to keep the balance exactly where it was. I didn't follow it. I smiled. Not the brittle smile of someone barely holding it together. A real one. Calm. Controlled. I nodded slightly, as if he'd just said something mildly interesting. I lifted my glass and took a sip. The silence stretched longer than before, uncomfortable now, because I hadn't given anyone the reaction they were waiting for. Mark glanced at me, surprise flickering across his face. Then relief. He misread my silence as submission, as acceptance, as proof that he could say whatever he wanted without consequence. That misunderstanding would cost him everything. Dinner continued, though the tone had shifted. Mark talked more. Elena laughed more. Their shared history began to surface in fragments. Old stories dressed up as nostalgia. I listened politely. I even asked a question once, just to see how far he'd go. He went far, farther than he ever had when we were alone. While he was busy impressing her, leaning into memories that didn't include me, I was doing something else entirely. I was detaching, cleanly, methodically. Emotionally, the decision had already been made. What remained was execution. I excused myself before dessert, apologizing lightly, citing a headache. In the restroom, I didn't cry. I didn't stare at my reflection, searching for answers. I already had them. I pulled out my phone and made the first move. Then the second. Then the third. Each call was calm, precise. No drama. No raised voice. Just instructions being followed. When I returned to the table, I was lighter. Mark barely noticed. He was too busy performing, too busy reclaiming a version of himself he thought he'd lost. I told him he should stay and enjoy the evening. I kissed his cheek. Elena watched closely, curiosity in her eyes. She thought she was winning something. She had no idea what was already gone. By the time Mark returned home hours later, laughing to himself as he replayed the night, his key no longer worked. He tried once, twice, harder. Confusion set in, then irritation. He knocked, then pounded, then called my name. Inside, I sat quietly with a glass of wine, the same calm smile on my face. The door stayed closed. Mark didn't stop knocking right away. At first it was confused, almost polite, as if the door itself had made a mistake. Then it became louder, sharper, the sound of entitlement hitting resistance for the first time. I stayed where I was, seated at the dining table, listening without reacting. There was something clarifying about hearing him on the other side of the door, separated by nothing more than wood and a decision I had finally made. My phone vibrated again. His name filled the screen. I didn't answer. A text followed, then another. Confusion turned into irritation, irritation into anger. The escalation was predictable. Mark had always believed access was automatic. To my time, to my patience, to my forgiveness. He believed marriage meant permanence, no matter what he said or did inside it. The locked door was not just a barrier. It was a correction. Eventually, the knocking stopped. I heard his footsteps retreat, the sound of his car, doors slamming, the engine starting too aggressively. He didn't leave because he understood. He left because he assumed this was temporary. A tantrum, a dramatic pause, something that would resolve itself once I calmed down. That assumption was the final confirmation I needed that I'd made the right choice. I slept better than I had in years. The next morning, I woke early, not from anxiety, but from habit. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, familiar and unchanged, even though everything else had shifted. I made coffee, drank it slowly, and opened my laptop. There were emails waiting. From my attorney, from the bank, from the property management company, confirming the lock change. Each message was professional, neutral, efficient. No one questioned my decision. No one asked if I was sure. They simply did what I asked. It was oddly affirming. Mark called again mid-morning. I let it ring. Then I sent a single text. We'll communicate through lawyers. Nothing more. No explanation. No emotional punctuation. Just a boundary, clearly stated. His reply came seconds later. A flurry of disbelief and outrage compressed into a handful of messages. He accused me of overreacting, of embarrassing him, of misinterpreting a harmless comment. He reminded me of our history, our home, our shared life. He even apologized, briefly, strategically, the way people do when they sense leverage slipping away. I didn't respond. Instead, I started moving through the house with intention. I photographed shared assets. I documented personal property. I opened drawers and closets Mark had claimed were his domain and cataloged what was inside. Not out of spite, out of preparation. Ending a marriage wasn't about anger. It was about accuracy. Around noon, Elena texted me. I hope you got home safe last night. I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I did. She typed back quickly. Mark didn't seem himself when he left. I hope I didn't make things awkward. I smiled at that. The careful distancing, the plausible innocence. I could almost admire it. No awkwardness, I replied. Clarity. She didn't respond after that. By the afternoon, Mark had returned. I heard his car again, this time slower. He stood on the porch for a long time before knocking. When I didn't answer, he tried calling. When I didn't pick up, he left another voicemail. This one was calmer, controlled, almost pleading. We should talk, he said, like adults. I listened to it once. Then I deleted it. Talking had been his arena for years. He talked things down, talked things around, talked until the original issue dissolved into fatigue. I wasn't stepping back into that pattern. If there was going to be communication, it would be structured, documented, and witnessed. That evening, I received an email from his lawyer. The tone was cautious, almost deferential. They wanted to discuss temporary arrangements, access to personal items, a schedule for retrieving belongings. I forwarded it to my attorney without comment. Dinner that night was quiet. I ate alone at the table we'd once shared, not out of loneliness, but out of ownership. Every object in the room felt different now, stripped of its assumptions. This wasn't a shared space anymore. It was a space in transition. Later, as I prepared for bed, my phone buzzed one last time. A message from Mark. You didn't even argue. I stared at it, recognizing the confusion behind the words. He wasn't upset about the door. He wasn't even upset about the divorce yet. He was unsettled by my lack of reaction, by the fact that I hadn't fought for him, hadn't begged, hadn't cried. That absence was louder than any confrontation. I typed a response, then deleted it. He didn't need an explanation. He needed to sit with the silence and figure it out himself. I turned off the light, closed my eyes, and let the quiet settle. The marriage hadn't ended with a fight. It had ended with a smile and a locked door. And in that stillness, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Relief. The third day, Mark stopped calling me directly. Instead, the messages began arriving indirectly, filtered through other people the way uncomfortable truths often are. A mutual friend texted to ask if everything was okay. His sister emailed, careful and concerned, reminding me how stressful work had been for him lately. Even my mother called, hesitant, saying Mark sounded confused and hurt. I listened politely, thanked them for their concern, and shared nothing. Silence, I was learning, made people reveal far more than words ever did. Mark, meanwhile, began constructing his version of events. I could see it forming in real time, passed from person to person like a revised script. I was emotional. I had misunderstood. I'd embarrassed him publicly. He never meant it the way it sounded. The marriage was strong until I overreacted. It was familiar territory for him. Mark had always believed that if he explained something enough times, reality would eventually align with his explanation. What unsettled him was that I wasn't participating. I didn't correct him. I didn't defend myself. I didn't counter his story with one of my own. I let his version exist, untouched, because I knew something he didn't. Narratives without opposition eventually collapse under their own contradictions. People start comparing notes. Timing stops lining up. Details shift. And when there is no emotional reaction to anchor the story, curiosity replaces sympathy. On the fourth morning, I received a call from my attorney. Mark was requesting mediation, not reconciliation. Mediation. The distinction mattered. It meant he was beginning to understand that this wasn't a phase. It was structural. I agreed, not because I wanted to negotiate with him directly, but because it moved things forward on my terms. That afternoon, Mark came to the house with his lawyer to retrieve personal belongings. I stayed in my home office while they moved through the rooms, the sound of drawers opening and closing drifting faintly down the hall. At one point, I heard him stop, his footsteps halting outside the door. He didn't knock. He just stood there. I imagined him trying to reconcile the silence with the image he had of me in his head. The emotional wife. The reactive partner. The woman who would eventually soften. I didn't open the door. When they left, the house felt lighter again. Not emptier, just more honest. I walked through the rooms afterward, noting what he'd taken and what he'd left behind. Predictable choices. Suits. Watches. His favorite books. He left the things that had never really mattered to him. Framed photos. Travel mementos. Objects that told a story he was no longer invested in maintaining. That night, I received an email from Elena. I didn't know, she wrote, about what he said, about how it landed. I never meant to cause harm. I read it twice before replying. You didn't cause it, I wrote. You revealed it. She responded almost immediately. He's been calling me, she admitted. Tried to explain. Trying to fix it. I'm sure, I replied. There was a pause, then one last message. I don't think he realizes what he lost. I closed the email without answering. Realization was not my responsibility. As the days passed, Mark's attempts to regain control grew subtler. He stopped blaming me outright and shifted to regret. He sent messages acknowledging mistakes, emphasizing how much he valued our marriage, how thoughtless his comment had been. He asked if we could talk just once, without lawyers, without pressure. The familiarity of the tactic almost made me smile. He still believed access was something he could negotiate. I didn't respond. Instead, I focused on rebuilding a rhythm that belonged solely to me. Morning walks. Evenings spent reading without interruption. Meals chosen because I liked them, not because they suited someone else's preferences. These small acts of autonomy accumulated into something powerful. They reminded me that my life did not require his acknowledgement to be valid. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sky darken, my phone buzzed again. A message from Mark. I don't understand how you could end 12 years without even fighting. I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing. I fought. I wrote. You just weren't listening. Then I turned off my phone. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, neutral territory chosen for its anonymity. A glass-walled conference room on the 12th floor of an office building downtown. The kind of place designed to feel temporary, so no one grew too comfortable. I arrived early, not out of nerves, but habit. Mark arrived late. That too was habit. He entered with an apology already half-formed on his lips, the expression he used when he wanted credit for accountability without fully accepting responsibility. He looked tired, not devastated, not broken, just unsettled. The confidence he usually carried so easily felt thinner now, like a jacket worn too many seasons in a row. He smiled when he saw me, a reflex, expecting something in return. I nodded politely and took my seat. His smile faltered, just slightly. The mediator began with procedural language, outlining goals, reminding us this was about resolution, not blame. Mark nodded along enthusiastically, grateful for structure. I listened quietly, my hands folded, my attention sharp. When it was Mark's turn to speak, he launched into a carefully prepared narrative. He acknowledged his comment at the dinner. He called it careless, poorly phrased, a joke taken the wrong way. He emphasized how deeply he valued our marriage, how blindsided he had been by my reaction. He spoke at length about stress, alcohol, misunderstanding. When he finished, the mediator turned to me. I didn't rush to speak. That pause did more than any rebuttal could have. It forced Mark to sit with his own words without interruption, without correction, without reassurance. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady. You didn't embarrass me, I said. You clarified something I had been ignoring. Mark frowned, confused. I never meant. I know what you meant, I said calmly. And more importantly, I know what you didn't consider. The mediator leaned forward slightly. Mark shifted in his chair. You didn't consider that I might stop negotiating for respect, I continued. You assumed I would react emotionally, then forgive you. You assumed that because I had before. That's not fair, Mark said quickly. I've always respected you. I looked at him directly. Respect isn't what you say when it's convenient, I said. It's what you protect when it costs you something. The room went quiet. The mediator glanced between us, sensing the shift. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time, he didn't have a ready explanation. I outlined my terms clearly. Division of assets, according to the prenup, he'd once dismissed as unnecessary formality. No public disparagement. Communication limited to legal channels. No closure conversations. No attempts to rewrite the timeline to make himself more comfortable. This wasn't punishment. It was boundary. Mark's lawyer asked for clarification on a few points, professional and measured. Mark himself stayed silent longer than usual. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower. You're really done, he said. Yes, I replied. Not cold, not angry, certain. He nodded slowly, as if testing the word in his mouth. Done. He had never taken it seriously before, because he'd never seen me choose myself over maintaining peace. That illusion had protected him for years. Now it was gone. After the meeting, Mark lingered while the lawyers packed up. He looked at me, searching my face for something he recognized. You've changed, he said. I've stopped waiting, I replied. Outside, the air felt lighter. I walked away without looking back, not because I wanted to hurt him, but because I no longer needed to measure my steps by his reaction. Later that day, I received confirmation emails, timelines, next steps. Each one marked progress, not loss. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the balcony as the city lights came on. Somewhere across town, Mark was likely replaying the dinner, the smile, the door that didn't open. He was probably still trying to pinpoint the exact moment things went wrong. The truth was simpler than he wanted to admit. Nothing went wrong. Something finally went right. Once the mediation ended, something subtle but important shifted in how people treated me. Not immediately, not dramatically. It started in small ways. Friends who had initially reached out with concern began asking different questions. Not what happened, but how are you holding up? The assumption had changed. I was no longer a woman in crisis. I was a woman in transition. That distinction mattered. Mark, however, was still stuck in explanation mode. I could tell from the way his lawyer framed emails, from the phrasing of proposed compromises that didn't actually compromise anything. He wanted reassurance disguised as resolution. He wanted me to confirm that he wasn't the villain in this story. He wanted absolution without accountability. And the most effective thing I did was refuse to give it to him. I didn't argue with his version of events when it surfaced through mutual acquaintances. I didn't correct his timeline. I didn't clarify his intentions. I let his words exist in the open air without support. The effect was almost immediate. Stories without reinforcement grow thin. People begin to notice inconsistencies. Someone would mention something Mark said, and another person would quietly point out that it didn't quite align with something else. I never had to step in. Silence did the work for me. One afternoon, I ran into a colleague of his at the grocery store. She hesitated before speaking, then said, "You seem calmer than I expected." It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation. I smiled and thanked her. Calm, unnerved people when they expected chaos. It suggested control. At home, I continued dismantling the emotional scaffolding of the marriage. I removed his belongings that remained, boxed neatly and labeled, ready for pickup. I redecorated small things first. New throw pillows, different lighting, changes subtle enough to feel intentional, not reactionary. The house began to reflect me again, not the version of myself I'd curated to coexist with him. Mark sent one final message that week, bypassing his lawyer. It was long, carefully written, and full of regret. He apologized again for the comment at dinner, insisted he'd never meant to diminish me, said Elena was just history, nothing more. He ended by asking if there was any chance we could reset and talk without intermediaries. I read it once. Then I archived it. Not responding wasn't cruelty. It was consistency. I had already explained myself. Repeating it would only teach him that persistence worked. Instead, I focused on what was ahead. The practicalities of separation. The logistics of a life that no longer required emotional negotiation. That weekend, I hosted a small dinner of my own. Not lavish, not performative, just a few close friends, good food, and conversation that didn't orbit around anyone's ego. No one asked about Mark. No one needed to. The absence spoke for itself. Later that night, after everyone had left, I stood in the quiet kitchen and realized something that surprised me. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Ending the marriage hadn't been about proving anything. It had been about reclaiming my footing. Mark would eventually understand what the smile at that dinner meant. Or he wouldn't. Either way, I no longer needed his understanding to move forward. That it was inevitable that Mark's version of events would eventually meet resistance. Narratives built on convenience rarely survive prolonged exposure to reality, especially when the person they rely on refuses to cooperate. The first visible crack appeared at a firm event he attended alone, a quarterly dinner he'd once insisted I never miss. This time, I wasn't there to smooth edges or absorb discomfort. And without me, his story had no anchor. I heard about it 2 days later, indirectly, through a friend who hadn't intended to gossip, but couldn't quite hide her curiosity. Mark had been asked casually where I was. He'd offered his usual explanation, something vague about space and misunderstanding. But then someone else mentioned the dinner. The comment, the smile, the locked door, though no one knew that detail yet. The room had gone quiet in a way Mark hadn't anticipated. People are good at sensing when a story doesn't settle right. They may not challenge it openly, but they remember. They compare. They recalibrate. And once doubt enters, it spreads quietly. Mark called me that night, breaking protocol. I let it ring out. He followed with a message, shorter than the others, stripped of its polish. People are asking questions. I didn't reply. The following week, the legal process moved forward. Documents were signed. Timelines established. The finality of it all began to register in a way that conversations never had. Mark's attempts to regain footing became more erratic. He alternated between apology and defensiveness, remorse and indignation. It was exhausting to witness, even from a distance. I, on the other hand, felt lighter with each small step completed. I opened a new account in my name alone. I updated beneficiaries. I changed passwords, routines, habits. Each action reinforced the same message to myself. This life was mine to manage. One evening, I received a message from Elena. Short, direct. I didn't realize how much he relied on you. I stared at the screen, surprised by the honesty. I typed back slowly. Neither did he. She didn't respond after that. Some realizations don't require dialogue. That night, I walked through the house, turning off lights, closing doors, settling into a rhythm that felt increasingly natural. The absence of Mark's presence no longer felt like a gap. It felt like space. Space to think. Space to breathe. Space to exist without anticipating someone else's reactions. I understood then that the dinner hadn't ended my marriage. It had simply revealed that it was already over. The smile hadn't been defiance. It had been acknowledgement. And the locked door hadn't been punishment. It had been closure. By the time the divorce paperwork moved from process to inevitability, something else had quietly completed its own transformation. I was no longer being discussed as a reaction. I had become a fact. People stopped asking why I did what I did and started adjusting to the reality that had been done. That shift was subtle, but it was everything. Mark still hadn't adapted. He reached out again, this time not with regret or justification, but with nostalgia. Messages that referenced old vacations, inside jokes, moments meant to soften me. It was another familiar tactic. If he could remind me of who we had been, maybe I'd forget who I was becoming. I didn't respond. Nostalgia is persuasive only when it's mutual, and mine had already expired. Instead, I focused on rebuilding my daily life in ways that felt deliberate rather than reactive. I changed my morning routine, waking earlier, walking before work. I started saying no without explaining myself. I stopped cushioning conversations with apologies. Each small boundary reinforced a larger truth. I was no longer managing anyone else's comfort. One afternoon, I received an unexpected call from Mark's sister. Her voice was careful, measured. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I agreed, not out of obligation, but curiosity. When we sat down, she didn't defend him. She didn't criticize me. She simply said, "He didn't think you'd leave like this." "I didn't think I would either," I replied. She nodded, absorbing that. "He keeps asking what he could have said differently." "That's the wrong question," I said calmly. She didn't argue. Instead, she sighed. "I think he's realizing how much of the marriage depended on you smoothing things over." That admission mattered, not because I needed validation, but because it confirmed what I'd suspected all along. I hadn't been passive. I'd been compensating. And once I stopped, the imbalance became impossible to ignore. That evening, Mark sent another message. Shorter this time. "I don't recognize you anymore." I stared at it for a long moment before replying. "That's because you never really saw me." It was the last message I sent him directly. From that point on, communication remained strictly formal, efficient, final. The emotional labor was over, and without it, Mark struggled to maintain the image he'd relied on. People noticed. They always do when someone loses their buffer. Meanwhile, my own life continued to expand. Not dramatically, not performatively, just steadily. I accepted invitations without checking with anyone. I planned trips without explaining their purpose. I laughed more freely, without scanning a room to see how it landed. The smile at that dinner had been the first sign of this version of me. The woman who didn't argue because she didn't need to. The woman who didn't cry because she was already done. That woman wasn't cruel. She was clear. And clarity, I learned, was the one thing Mark had never prepared for. There was a moment, quiet and almost forgettable, when I realized the dynamic had fully inverted. It happened at a mutual acquaintance's birthday dinner, weeks after the mediation. I almost didn't go, not because I was afraid of seeing Mark, but because I no longer felt obligated to occupy shared spaces just to prove I could. I went anyway, on my own terms, arriving when I wanted, leaving the moment it stopped serving me. Mark was already there. He stood near the bar, drink in hand, posture carefully arranged to suggest ease. When he saw me, his expression shifted automatically, the old reflex kicking in. He straightened, smiled, prepared himself. For years, rooms had adjusted around him. Conversations bent slightly in his direction. People waited for his cues. I watched detached now, as he attempted to reclaim that gravitational pull. It didn't work. People greeted him politely, then turned back to their conversations. When I entered, there was no dramatic pause, no tension, just recognition. A few warm smiles. Someone handed me a glass of wine. Another person asked about my recent trip. No one looked at Mark to see how he felt about it. That was the moment, the one where I understood something fundamental had shifted. Mark noticed it too. He drifted closer, inserting himself into a conversation I was already having. The attempt was subtle, but familiar. I acknowledged him with a nod, then continued speaking to the person beside me. He waited for an opening that never came. Eventually, he excused himself, returning to the bar. I didn't follow. I didn't watch. I didn't need to. Later, someone mentioned the dinner, the one where everything had changed. Not with curiosity, with mild disbelief. "I still can't believe he said that," they said. "And you just smiled." I smiled again, smaller this time. There wasn't anything to discuss. That answer traveled faster than any explanation ever could. In the weeks that followed, Mark's presence in shared circles diminished. Not dramatically, just gradually. Invitations slowed. Conversations shortened. Without me absorbing social friction, his sharper edges became more noticeable. It wasn't malicious. It was structural. He had relied on my emotional intelligence to maintain equilibrium. Without it, imbalance was inevitable. One evening, as I walked home from dinner with friends, my phone buzzed. A message from Mark. Not an apology, not an argument, just a statement. "I think I finally understand." I didn't reply. Understanding, I had learned, wasn't owed a response. It was something people sat with on their own. I slipped my phone into my pocket and kept walking, the city lights reflecting off windows like possibilities I no longer had to ask permission to explore. Freedom didn't arrive the way people like to describe it. There was no dramatic exhale, no sudden joy, no triumphant declaration that I had survived and emerged stronger. Instead, it showed up quietly, disguised as normalcy. One day, I realized I hadn't thought about Mark at all until mid-afternoon. Another day passed where his name didn't cross my mind once. That absence felt more meaningful than any closure conversation ever could. The divorce proceedings moved forward steadily, predictably. Paperwork, signatures, deadlines. I handled each step with the same calm precision that had carried me through the night I changed the locks. Mark's lawyer attempted a few last-minute adjustments, small requests framed as reasonable compromises. I declined where it mattered and agreed where it didn't. The process wasn't adversarial. It was administrative. That distinction stripped it of its emotional charge. I began noticing how differently people spoke to me now. Not softer, clearer. They didn't tiptoe around my feelings or offer unsolicited reassurance. They asked direct questions and accepted direct answers. It was as if my refusal to dramatize the end of my marriage had recalibrated their expectations of me. I was no longer someone to manage. I was someone to engage. One afternoon, I ran into Elena again, unexpectedly at a gallery opening. She looked surprised to see me, then relieved. We exchanged polite greetings, the kind people offer when they share a complicated history they don't intend to revisit. After a moment, she said, "You seem lighter." "I am," I replied. She hesitated. "He's not." I nodded, not unkindly. "He's adjusting." There was a pause. Then she said something that surprised me. "I don't think I ever knew him the way I thought I did." I smiled slightly. "That makes two of us." We didn't speak much after that. Some connections don't need resolution. They simply dissolve once their purpose is fulfilled. As weeks turned into months, my life continued to expand in ways that felt organic rather than reactive. I took on new projects at work, ones I'd previously declined because they didn't fit neatly into our shared schedule. I traveled without reporting my itinerary to anyone. I spent time alone without feeling like I was waiting for something to begin. One evening, as I sat in my living room reading, I realized something else. The smile at that dinner hadn't been an act of restraint. It had been recognition. Recognition that I no longer needed to explain my worth to someone who had already decided where to place it. That realization had been instantaneous, irreversible. Mark sent one final email before the divorce was finalized. It wasn't defensive or apologetic. It was reflective. He wrote about lessons learned, about regret, about wishing he had understood sooner. I read it carefully, then filed it away. I didn't respond. Not because it wasn't sincere, but because my response was no longer required for his growth. On the day the divorce became official, I didn't celebrate. I went for a walk. I bought groceries. I cooked dinner. Life continued, unremarkable and entirely mine. That, I realized, was the point. Freedom didn't need an audience. It didn't need validation. It simply existed, quietly reshaping everything around it. There was a moment, weeks after the divorce papers were signed, when I caught my reflection in a store window and didn't immediately recognize the woman looking back at me. Not because she looked dramatically different, but because her posture had changed. Shoulders relaxed, gaze forward, no anticipation of someone else's mood. It startled me how visible that shift was once I noticed it. Mark noticed it too. We ran into each other unexpectedly at a cafe near my office. He looked thinner, not in a way that suggested growth, but in a way that suggested depletion. He smiled when he saw me, tentative, unsure whether the gesture was still welcome. I returned it politely. We exchanged a few neutral sentences about schedules and weather. Then he paused, studying me. "You seem ahead," he said. I didn't ask ahead of what. I didn't need to. I kept moving, I replied. That answer lingered between us. It wasn't unkind. It was factual. Mark had spent months trying to understand what went wrong, replaying the dinner, the door, the mediation. I had spent those months building a life that no longer revolved around understanding him. The divergence was irreversible. He asked if we could sit. I agreed, briefly. He talked about therapy, about reflection, about things he wished he'd done differently. He spoke earnestly, but there was a familiar undertone beneath it. He still believed insight could substitute for change. I listened without interrupting, then stood when he finished. "I'm glad you're doing the work," I said, "but you don't need to bring it to me." He looked confused. "I thought you'd want to know." "I already lived it," I replied. That was the last time we spoke in person. As my life continued to settle into its new shape, I became increasingly aware of how often I had once diminished myself to maintain equilibrium. I noticed it in conversations where I no longer softened my opinions, in decisions I made without seeking consensus, in the way I occupied space without apology. None of it was aggressive. It was simply unfiltered. Friends commented on it occasionally. "You're different," they'd say, not accusingly, just observantly. I'd smile and agree. Different wasn't something to defend anymore. One evening, as I hosted a small gathering at my place, someone brought up the infamous dinner. Not with gossip, but with admiration. "I still think about how you handled that," they said. "Most people would have exploded." "I didn't need to," I replied. The situation resolved itself. And it had. The marriage hadn't ended because of one comment. It had ended because I finally stopped absorbing disrespect in silence. The smile had been the signal. The locked door had been the boundary. Everything after had simply followed. As the night wound down and guests left, I stood alone in my living room, the quiet settling comfortably around me. I thought back to that lavish dinner, the clink of glasses, the eyes waiting for my reaction. I smiled again, not because I was remembering pain, but because I was remembering the exact moment I chose myself. He surprised me how often people confuse regret with change. Mark wasn't the only one who did it, but he was the clearest example. In the months after the divorce, I heard through familiar channels that he spoke about me differently now, with care, with admiration, sometimes even with reverence, as if altering the tone after the fact could rewrite the meaning of what had already happened. It couldn't. Respect offered after the loss of access is not respect. It's recognition delayed beyond its usefulness. I encountered that realization firsthand at a professional conference I attended in early spring. It was the kind of event Mark and I used to attend together, where he'd introduce me as his wife before mentioning my actual work as an afterthought. This time, I was there on my own merit, presenting on a panel. When my name was announced, there was no association attached to it, no relational qualifier, just me. After the panel, Mark appeared. I hadn't known he'd be there. He stood at the edge of the room, waiting until the crowd thinned before approaching. His presence didn't unsettle me the way it once would have. It registered like weather, not threatening, just there. "That was impressive," he said. "I always knew you were capable of that." I looked at him steadily. Knowing and supporting aren't the same thing. He nodded, accepting the correction without argument. That at least was new. "I see that now," he said. "I wish I'd shown it when it mattered." I considered him for a moment. The man he was, the man he had been, the man he might still become. "So do I," I said honestly. But wishing doesn't change timing. We stood there in silence, the conversation complete without resolution. When I walked away, I felt no urge to look back. Later that evening, as I sat in my hotel room reviewing notes from the conference, I reflected on how much my internal landscape had shifted. I no longer evaluated moments based on whether they would have mattered to Mark. I evaluated them based on whether they mattered to me. That recalibration had been gradual, but it was now complete. I realized then that the dinner hadn't just ended my marriage. It had ended my tolerance for delayed acknowledgement, for conditional respect, for affection that required self-erasure to maintain. The locked door hadn't been about exclusion. It had been about refusal. A refusal to remain in spaces where my value was optional. Mark's respect, when it finally arrived, did so without access, without authority, without relevance. And that was the quiet justice of it. Not punishment, alignment. As I turned off the light that night, I felt something settle into place with finality. I hadn't lost anything essential. I had simply stopped carrying what was never meant to be mine. There is a peculiar stillness that arrives when you stop performing for someone else's expectations. It isn't loneliness. It isn't emptiness. It's space. And space, I learned, can be transformative when you're finally allowed to fill it with your own intentions instead of someone else's comfort. After the divorce was finalized and the conversations tapered off into polite distance, my days began to feel unstructured in a way that was both unsettling and exhilarating. I didn't rush to define myself again. That was important. For years, my identity had been contextual. Mark's wife, Mark's plus one, Mark's stabilizer. Even my accomplishments had been framed in relation to his trajectory, his schedule, his priorities. Removing that framework left me momentarily unmoored. So I let myself drift deliberately. I allowed routines to form naturally instead of forcing them into productivity or narrative. I spent time alone without turning it into a statement. I took walks without tracking steps or thinking about efficiency. I cooked meals slowly, experimenting, making mistakes, throwing things away without apologizing to anyone. These were small acts, but they accumulated into something profound. They reminded me that I was allowed to exist without justification. People noticed the change, though they rarely named it directly. Friends commented that I seemed more present. Colleagues remarked on my decisiveness. Even strangers interacted with me differently, responding to a calm certainty that hadn't been there before. Confidence, I discovered, wasn't loud. It was consistent. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes I'd never unpacked during the marriage, I found a journal from my early 20s. Before Mark. Before compromise became second nature. I sat on the floor and read entries filled with ambition, curiosity, and a clear sense of self I'd gradually diluted over time. It wasn't that I had lost that woman. I had simply deferred her. That realization stayed with me. Deferred is not erased. Deferred can be reclaimed. I began saying yes to things that scare me a little. A solo trip, a leadership role at work, a public lecture I would once have declined to avoid scheduling conflicts. Each yes reinforced the same truth. My capacity had never been the issue. My permission had. Occasionally, Mark crossed my mind, not with longing, but with a kind of distant empathy. I understood now how much of our marriage had relied on me absorbing discomfort to keep things balanced. Without that absorption, his world had felt harsher, less forgiving. That wasn't cruelty on my part. It was consequence. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the city settle into night, I thought again about that lavish dinner. The moment, the sentence, the eyes waiting for my reaction. I realized how small that moment actually was in the context of everything that followed. It wasn't the climax. It was the catalyst. A single point of clarity that allowed an entire life to realign. I smiled to myself, not out of satisfaction, but recognition. The woman who had smiled at that table hadn't been suppressing herself. She had been stepping aside, so something stronger could emerge. By the time summer arrived, the story no longer belonged to anyone else. Not to Mark, not to the friends who had whispered about the dinner, not even to the version of me who had once believed that dignity required explanation. What remained was something quieter and far more durable. I had stopped needing the last word. That change showed itself in unexpected ways. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head. I no longer imagined what I would say if I ran into Mark again, or how I would respond if someone asked the wrong question. Those mental habits had faded because they were no longer necessary. I trusted myself to respond honestly in the moment or not at all. Either choice felt equally valid. Mark did reach out once more, indirectly, through a mutual acquaintance who mentioned that he wanted to return something he'd found among his things. A book, one I'd lent him years ago, with notes in the margins. I told the acquaintance to let him keep it. The message that came back was confused, then disappointed, then silent. He was still searching for symbolic exchanges, gestures that might reopen a line of communication. I wasn't out at work. Opportunities continued to unfold in ways that felt almost effortless. Not because I was working less, but because I was no longer dividing my energy. Decisions came faster. Boundaries held. I noticed how often I was deferred to in meetings, not out of politeness, but trust. People sensed when someone was no longer negotiating their own authority. One evening, at a small gathering, a woman I barely knew pulled me aside. She'd heard the story, she said, and wanted to know how I'd managed not to react, not to lash out, not to break down. I considered the question carefully before answering. I didn't need to prove anything, I said. I already knew what I was worth. She nodded slowly, as if filing the thought away for later. I realized then that the story had begun to function differently. It wasn't about betrayal anymore. It was about restraint, about the power of choosing silence not as submission, but as conclusion. That night, walking home under warm streetlights, I felt an unexpected sense of gratitude, not for the pain or the humiliation or even the ending of the marriage, but for the moment of clarity that had cut through years of accommodation. The smile at that table had not been passive. It had been decisive. Somewhere behind me, Mark was likely still explaining, still contextualizing, still trying to locate the precise error that had undone everything. He might never fully understand that it wasn't the sentence itself that ended us. It was what the sentence revealed. And once revealed, it could not be unseen. I unlocked my door, stepped inside, and closed it gently behind me. No dramatic finality. No slamming, just a door closing because it no longer needed to stay open. The last realization arrived without ceremony. No dramatic confrontation. No final message from Mark. No sudden epiphany in the middle of the night. It came on an ordinary morning as I stood in my kitchen, sunlight spilling across the counter, coffee brewing quietly. I realized I hadn't framed a single thought around him in days. Not out of effort, out of absence. That was when I understood that the story was finished. Not because everything had been resolved perfectly, but because it no longer required my attention to exist. Mark's presence in my life had shifted from central to incidental. His opinions, his regrets, his late arriving respect had lost their weight. They floated somewhere outside the perimeter of my decisions, irrelevant to the direction I was moving, that I began noticing how differently I moved through the world now. I made choices without checking how they would be received. I spoke plainly without cushioning my words. I allowed pauses in conversation without rushing to fill them. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of alignment. I was no longer performing emotional labor for the sake of harmony. I was simply being honest. Occasionally, people still brought up the dinner, the comment, the smile, the locked door. But now, they did it with a kind of reverence, as if it had become legend rather than gossip. A moment that represented something larger than the marriage itself. I listened politely when it happened, then redirected the conversation. I didn't need to relive it. Its purpose had already been fulfilled. One afternoon, as I was leaving work, I passed a couple arguing quietly on the sidewalk. The woman looked exhausted, explaining something for the third or fourth time. The man nodded without really listening. I recognized the dynamic instantly. I also recognized the moment before the breaking point. It wasn't the argument itself. It was the realization that no amount of explanation would create respect where it hadn't been chosen. I hoped she would find her smile. That evening, I hosted friends for dinner. Nothing lavish. No chandeliers. No performance. Just food, laughter, and conversation that flowed without tension. As I cleared the table later, I caught myself smiling again. Not the smile from that night months ago, sharp with clarity and finality. This one was softer, rooted, unquestioned. I thought back to the woman I had been at that lavish dinner. The one everyone expected to react, to plead, to correct, to fight. I felt compassion for her, not pity. She had done exactly what she needed to do in that moment. She had chosen dignity over drama, direction over defense. The door that hadn't opened that night had done more than lock Mark out. It had opened something else entirely. A life where my worth was not up for debate. Where respect was not negotiated after the fact. Where love, if it came again, would not require silence to survive. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I understood something with absolute certainty. I had not ended my marriage in anger. I had ended it in recognition. And recognition, once it arrives, changes everything. And that is what people never understand when they hear the story. It wasn't the comment that ended my marriage. It wasn't the ex, the dinner, or even the humiliation. It was the moment I saw, with absolute clarity, that love without respect is just endurance dressed up as loyalty. I didn't raise my voice because I didn't need to. I didn't cry because I was already done. I smiled because I finally chose myself. And when the door didn't open that night, it wasn't an act of revenge. It was the sound of a life closing behind me, and a future opening, one where my worth was never again up for discussion.